Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Rev Dr Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister. Thanks for coming in, Sandy.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm rather surprised and honoured to be invited, so thank you.
Well, you've got a good story, and I think in our earlier discussion you mentioned something about your connection with ministers and religion going right back. Where did that all start?
Well, we could start with my great-grandfather, who was a Presbyterian minister in Scotland, who then emigrated to Australia in the 19th century with his family. And he and my grandfather, who was Professor of New Testament at the Presbyterian Theological Hall in the late 1940s, and then my father and my uncle were all Presbyterian ministers. So when I was age 16, the question for me was, well, do I follow the family tradition or do I do something else? Yes, and this was quite a struggle at the time, because I didn't feel any alienation from the tradition. It seemed to me to be benevolent and good-hearted. But it didn't have a great deal of feeling or personal commitment either at that moment. And I remember saying that to my father, that I agreed with all the Christian stuff, but I didn't feel anything particular. And that did change over time. But at the time, what the decision was really made around the thought that this was an open future, not a definite role that I was opting for.
Okay.
It was clear to me that parish ministry was something I understood but didn't feel any particular call to. But ministry in the church was something again. It was a bit broader and more involved in what I would think of as cultural formation, being responsible for receiving messages from the wider world and interpreting them somehow, and hopefully in the light of Christian faith.
Yes, so it's sort of a sociological component to it, was it?
I think so. It's hard to know. I think it was more the sense that there wasn't anything else that was calling me either. I mean, I then went on to go to university, started out doing an honours degree in philosophy and history, dropped the history after second year because it meant too much reading, and I decided I didn't need that level of detail.
Yes.
And philosophy was where the struggle was. You know, how do you make sense of the world?
Right.
And in that time, I joined the student Christian movement when I first went, which was part of the family tradition. You'd probably be aware that the student Christian movement began in Australia in 1896, part of the World Student Christian Federation that started in 1895. Right. Anyway, my grandfather and my mother's father, my other grandfather, were both very active in the student Christian movement in the 1900s, early 1900s. And my parents actually met through the student Christian movement.
Good heavens. Yes.
So it's in the blood, so to speak.
Certainly, yes.
And anyway, when I went to Melbourne University, the first thing I did pretty much was to join the student Christian movement. That was a good move. Good people, good program, lots of interesting questions being asked, and quite challenging. So that was formative, just being part of those conversations and that social network.
So what sort of conversations, so what years this we're looking at?
It was 1959 to 1962 at Melbourne University.
Right.
And from there, I was actually accepted for the Presbyterian ministry at the age of 16.
Oh, good heavens.
Yeah,
right,
which wouldn't happen in the Uniting Church nowadays, but that's what happened to me. I think it was because of the pedigree.
Yes, I'm not surprised. but just going back to the student Christian movement, what did it look like when you joined it? What sort of activities were taking place?
Well, every holiday in the 3-term year, they had a conference to which about 100 people would go. This is a local Melbourne SCM event, and they'd have about a 3 or 4 day program, and there would be speakers who are usually university professors or theologians. They'd have Bible study, and they'd be looking at the rest of the world and trying to decide which way was up. What is God doing in this world was I think, one of the questions.
So what would you be looking at? Would like abortion or those sorts
Less
of issues?
so. No, it was, the things I remember were questions about what is the relevance of the church, what is the mission of the church. I think that was big in those years. and questions about sort of unions and the structure of society, injustice in social arrangements,
Yes.
and world poverty, those sorts of
Those
concerns.
types, yeah.
Much more a more a left agenda than a right agenda, to put it very, very crudely.
Yes, it sounds so. Going back again, what sort of justice issues were current at that time? It would have raised.
Well, we in 1962, Melbourne University had a big anti-hanging movement.
Oh, okay.
And this was around the trial of Robert Ryan,
Yes,
who was eventually hanged.
Yeah.
And I can remember walking up and down in front of Victorian Parliament House at 3 a.m. as part of a picket line with one other person, saying don't hang anybody, basically.
Yes.
And so that was the kind of thing. The other one was anti-apartheid.
Of course.
Concern about apartheid was very strong. Racism, basically, opposition to racism, and some awareness of Aboriginal land rights at that time.
So, it was, as you say, it was more left than right, but they were very topical issues.
Oh, indeed. And it wasn't that the other issues weren't addressed. It was simply they were seen as things that people would need to talk about and study and come to some, personal and perhaps collective conclusion.
Absolutely, and also look for where the church is in that, in some effective
Listen to
way.
the church's voice and see if it made sense.
Yes, a big one.
And sometimes it did.
Yeah, that's right. And then we won't talk about the places where it didn't. But if you've got, so that's also, when you say church, does that, obviously it does, but at the conscious level, does that encompass Jesus? Is it sort of the Jesus approach? Or the church approach?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the church was experienced as part of the frame of life because I've been going to church all my life, grown up in the church, grown up in the manses of the church, Presbyterian church. It was exciting to meet people from other denominations in the SCM. That was one of the big things, that you actually realised that not all Christians thought the same way as Presbyterians.
That's right.
And that was quite a discovery.
Yes, yes.
And sometimes they had things to say that Presbyterians needed to hear, and that took a little bit longer to discern.
That's very interesting. So it sort of broadened out your sense of Christianity or sense of Christ.
Absolutely. And also the challenge of Christ. I think the challenge of Christ to not only the world but also the church was very strong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we have our challenges as well, and it's time, but we'll come back to the challenges of Christ. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister. And we were talking about the movement of student Christian movement, the Australian student Christian movement. There were some interesting aspects to that. What were some of the principles to being able to enter that movement?
Well, the basic challenge to enter the movement was to make some sort of commitment to following Jesus, following the way of Christ, and to test the truth of that with your life.
Right.
So what that meant was obviously very open, but at least it implied seriousness.
Very open, but challenging. Absolutely challenging.
Yes.
So what sort of challenges did you find in this aspect of following Christ and making that the...
Well, I thought I had a fairly good handle on the way of Christ, simply from upbringing. So that side of it it wasn't a point of learning for me, I think. It was more the sense of engagement with the world and the mission of God in the world. And what did that mean? And how did you do that?
Yes.
And did that mean that you could go on demonstrations, for example?
Yes.
And, I discovered that it did, in fact, mean that. So I remember going to an SCM conference at the end of my first year, a national conference, which was over a week in January. And they have quiet time at those conferences, half an hour. And I went off into this quiet time and just doing nothing. Suddenly the words formed up in my mind, "Be still and know that I am God."
Yes.
And I thought, where did that come from?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
But that was in fact what I now look back on as my own personal calling.
Right.
To be still and to know. and my life has been around trying to understand. My career has been philosophy and to some extent theology, and it's really around knowing. And if you can see clearly, then you know what to do.
Yes.
So anything that I have done has been kind of symbolic and flowing out from a response to something that's going on that other people have generated. Very few things have actually generated myself in anything like that leading sort of way, but very responsive. And always there's something that you can actually contribute, even if it's just one word or a listening ear.
I suspect that part of it might be reflected too in the Eastern perception that you've reached your zenith when you know you don't know.
Yes, yes.
And that's sort of partly what you're alluding to there.
Indeed,
yes,
indeed. And being still and knowing that I am God, what does that mean? And where is the knowledge of God in that?
Yes.
And it's much more in the emptiness than it is in the content.
Yes.
The content is on the edges. The emptiness is what's really important.
Yeah. Yes.
And very hard to explain.
Yeah, it's in the waiting, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned most of your life's been in the philosophical side. How did that manifest itself for you?
Well, I went from studying theology in Melbourne to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and then went overseas to study doctoral work at Princeton. Came back a bit incomplete, but anyway, I was ordained to be the General Secretary of the Student Christian Movement. I was actually the last General Secretary of the Australian Student Christian Movement, because numbers went right down and something fell out of it, which is a puzzle. A puzzle that I've never fully understood, to be honest. But anyway, the other dimension of it really was what would you do professionally? And for me, teaching was much closer to my heart than parish ministry.
Right.
So I came back to Australia, and firstly to work for the Student Christian Movement, and right after that I took a one-year post teaching philosophy at Swinburne College, and then went to a Melbourne State College in Carlton as a teacher of philosophy. So that was my full-time work.
Right.
And during that time I had a part-time honorary ministry in Fitzroy and then in Carlton. And that was what I had set up while I was General Secretary of the SCM. But because of a very small congregation in this inner city church.
Yes.
And two other people who also had part-time commitment to it. So that worked okay and worked well for me.
So it kept you in touch with, what did it feel like, that transition from the teacher of philosophy and the person who's obviously, a lot of that's head work, to the heart work? What was that transition feel like?
Well, it was more the engagement socially, that this, in Fitzroy particularly, there's a raw edge to the community at that time.
Yes.
And it was really good to be part of that. And it keeps you humble. I mean, that was one of the great things I got from it. Because you just don't know what you can do for some of the people that come your way and actually want help. And are you helping them or aren't you if you give them $10?
Yes, yes. That's very much where the question of what would Christ do in this moment arises.
I was very fortunate to actually meet and marry my wife, who was a social worker. And so her advice to me was always invaluable in these more practical matters. I relied heavily upon it. And,
So just going back, and I realise you sort of shook your head and said, I don't really know what dropped out, but have you got any idea, any feeling about what might have dropped out of the movement?
Well, I think so. I think the ecumenical movement in Australia got going after the Second World War in response to the chaos and pain and horror of war.
Yes.
And Nazism and racism. So the ecumenical movement is saying these things in the world are wrong. Now what can we get together and do about it? And so while people were still, in a sense, focused outwards on stopping these things from happening again, the ecumenical movement was strong.
Yes.
When we got to about 1965, the long period of affluence in Australia started to kick in. And so people became much more comfortable and they had many more options. And so everyone had all sorts of other options that they could get busy about and leave it to somebody else to worry about racism and war and peace and poverty and so on. And I just think that was a big part of the explanation. But it's impossible to go further than that suggestion, I think.
Well, yes, but it's a very good point, and it perhaps too it alludes to what may be happening now, because those sorts of issues are rising again.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we've got some fairly strong, well, with the radical, I'm not going to call it Muslim movement because it's not Muslim, but that radical movement in the Middle East. Yes.
And the same issues are there, and we need the same responses, and we need to draw on the past experience.
And I need to do the same response. We're out of time. We'll be back though. We'll be back in a moment.
Allah, Alleluia, Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister. We've talked about a lot of background stuff, Sandy. What's the more recent development? What's been happening over the last 10 years, whatever it is?
Yeah, well, I retired in 2012 from the position of Secretary for Christian Unity for the Uniting Church Assembly. So that was secretary to the group that is responsible for the ecumenical relations of the Uniting Church.
Oh, okay.
So that means the monitoring and nominating people to represent the Uniting Church in ecumenical organisations, National Council of Churches in Australia, World Council of Churches, Christian Conference of Asia, and a few others. And also the dialogue with other churches. So we have active dialogues with the Anglicans, Baptists just completed, Lutherans and Roman Catholics and Salvation Army at this time. So that was all very engaging stuff and quite important.
Yes, absolutely.
I got into that, I think, through coming from philosophy to theology, because at the end of my time teaching philosophy, I ended up going to Tonga for 5 years to teach theology.
Oh, okay.
Which was a great time.
Yes.
I came back from there because I had a sense, firstly we had a grandson born, and so my wife was coming back, so I was coming back. And I had a 1-year stint as the Dean of Students at the Theological College.
Okay.
And then got this job with the Christian Unity Working Group as a half-time position. Anyway, the sense I had was that I needed to bring something back to the church from my long period on the edge of the official and established church. And the sense that it mattered ecumenically. That is, that the Uniting Church has a particular vocation to be a kind of a vanguard forerunner group for the world church. To keep trying to address the issues that the church struggles to find a way to address. And I think there is some truth in that, and we have done some of that. Other churches do other bits of it, but the Uniting Church is important in that area.
Yes, yes. So this ecumenical side of it, is that still strong?
I would say it is not strong in the sociological sense. It's strong in the theological sense. In that this is really what matters, and there are enough people who know that, at least in the Uniting Church, and I think in other churches in Australia, for it to still be not just viable but actually creative, and that's what matters.
And the Uniting Church, if I recall, is fairly active in charity and activities.
Big social welfare establishment. That's what's well known and very public and very good. The actual work I'm talking about is probably not there so much. It's more to do with the justice work of the church, concern about social justice matters and research.
Yes.
And the ecumenical involvement, bringing in the knowledge from overseas and what's happening in overseas churches, and reflecting on what that means for Australia. So that work, I think, is equally important.
Absolutely, it is. Well, who do you talk to when you come out with some good research and some good into ecumenical decisions? Where does it go to?
Well, it goes partly to the church itself, and that's through the ecumenical channels. You know, you just have to keep telling this story and asking these questions, because it's the questions that teach us. So that's, even if you can't see much fruit for that, long term, that's what matters. So that work is still going on. Then after that, you see occasional action. For example, in 2009, the Uniting Church changed its preamble. So that it recognised the first peoples of the land.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and the fact that their wisdom was not respected when second peoples arrived in force. So that's now in the Uniting Church Constitution as a preamble.
Well, that's 2009. Just give us an idea, if you know, what other churches' timetable was on that. Is it something that's been recognised a long time ago, or is it?
I don't believe any other church has done something similar.
Good heavens.
I don't think so. Not at that level.
No.
I don't believe.
No, we won't hold it as a fact, but
No,
it's certainly...
As far as I'm aware,
Yeah.
no other church has done that. And it's exactly what we're trying to do with the national constitution now. You know,
Right.
there's a real movement for this, and I think it's essential.
So there's that groundswell, this type of thing creates that groundswell, as you say, within the churches, but in society. When does it reach the deaf ears of politicians?
Well, I think this one has. I mean, that's why I say there is a movement, and they just don't want to put it to the people until they've got a sense that a majority might pass it. So
Yes.
they're canny and delaying it. Fine,
Yeah.
you know.
Yes, but there is an awareness at that level.
There is,
Yeah.
and they've called for it. So, and there's a group studying it and trying to draft what it might look like, and struggling, you know, to find a formulation that's not going to get them into what they would regard as too much trouble.
Sounds as though there's some pretty good minds involved in this.
I think so. Yes. Yeah. I mean,
Yes.
I've been impressed with my colleagues in the assembly leadership. Yeah. And also ecumenically. I mean, the people that I've met in ecumenical conversation across the churches have been very impressive in general terms.
So, any other major issues, social issues that you look at?
Well, we could always talk about the welcome to asylum seekers as a starting point, and that's another example where we're going the wrong way nationally, and the churches have said that for a long time and have not been, I think, properly respected for what they're saying.
And it's an area where the question of what would Christ do in this rings loud.
Well, Christ was himself a refugee as a baby.
Yes, yes, it rings loud.
Yeah.
Where has that been pushed? Is there a groundswell which has reached government?
I think so. I mean, there's Uniting Justice has put together a lot of resources. The Jesuits were the first on the ground with this about 25 years ago.
Yes,
and we've been relating closely to other churches on this as well. But there are a lot of local welcome committees and actions and organisational stuff for looking after refugees.
Yes,
from the churches. And if you didn't have the church's response to refugees, we would have a much greater problem than we currently have with those who are already here.
Yes.
And particularly those who are not allowed to work and oppressed in that sort of way.
Yes, it's a bit troubling that the public relations for the churches are not more effective, because there's a lot of people who don't understand that that's actually happening and the relevance of it.
We're still in quarantine from the media.
Yeah, yes, I'd say so.
That's the real problem.
We're not in quarantine from time, however, but would you come back next week, because we'd like to, you've written a couple of books, like to talk to you about some of those.
Very happy to talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Sandy. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back next week and we'll be speaking with Sandy Yule again. Thanks for watching. See you then.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu